Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event today. Really excited to talk to you all. I'm Allison Parker, and I'm the director of our open science work in the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Wilson Center. That includes a portfolio of efforts addressing how emerging participatory and open approaches to science are changing the way that science happens. So just for a quick introduction to the Wilson Center, we are a think tank and nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue. So we're really excited to play that role today, hosting this conversation, exploring the opportunities and challenges and the potential of open data. We plan to reflect on progress in recent years and also address what's needed from here. So on behalf of the Wilson Center Science and Technology Innovation Program and also our collaborators at Google, I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to this virtual event, exploring the progress and promise of open data in the context of open science. Our motivation in putting this event together today was sort of the observation that there's been quite a lot of progress in open data over the last number of years, but also a recognition now that we have sort of a ways to go before open data is truly accessible and equitable in its contribution to science and other aspects of science and society. We hope to use this opportunity to sort of take stock of where we are and what is needed to more fully realize this potential. So to get us going on that mission, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Chris Markham. Chris is the Assistant Director for Open Science and Data Policy in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So with OSTP, Chris co-chairs the President's Scientific Integrity Fast Track Action Committee, which continues his previous service from NIH. And in addition to scientific integrity, his portfolio includes priorities that aim to make federal open science more accessible and equitable for all Americans. Chris's PhD is in sociology from the University of California, Irvine, and he previously served as a postdoc at the RAND Corporation and in the research faculty at the National Human Genome Research Institute. So we're so pleased he could join us today. Really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Chris, on open data as part of a transformative open science agenda, and also what's next for this really important and wide-ranging discussion on open data policy and practice. So I'll hand it over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Allison. And I'm going to ask the Wilson Center to please share my slides. I first want to express gratitude to Wilson Center and to the organizers for the invitation to provide a keynote today at this great event. And really to be a part of the illustrious panel of our colleagues to discuss transformative opportunities for open data. As Allison mentioned, in addition to open science and data policy, I help lead the scientific integrity and data security portfolios at OSTP. Both of those topics, as you know, intersect with open data in really important ways. For the talk today, I just want to be clear that my focus here is on open digital data, and not physical samples or lab notes, ethnographic materials. And although we think certainly those other scientific products are really worth highlighting in other conversations, but today we'll be really focused in on digital data. I'll begin here by setting the stage on two related concepts that the panel will be discussing in greater detail. The first, of course, is open data and what we mean by that. And the second is a set of principles known as FAIR, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. The panel's asked me to provide some guiding points on these and to cover a few of the opportunities in achieving what are really ideals for open data and fairness. And of course, my priorities here are aligned highly with the Biden-Harris administration's agenda. And making access to federal data has been a key part of the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to improve transparency and equity in government science. Next slide, please. So the reason we're all here today is to talk about open data, recognizing that in the huge field of data and information sciences, there are multiple definitions in the open science community for what it means. What does open data mean? But I think in the very simplest terms, we can consider data to be open when anyone can freely access, use, and share it without charge and without any real restrictions. It's important to note, though, that open data is really an ideal for scientific discovery, translation, and collaboration. It's something that exists that we have yet to really truly attain as a field. However, from a policy perspective, we also need to recognize that not all scientific and research data can be open under the broadest possible terms. That is, not all scientific data can be freely accessed, freely used, and freely shared. There are limitations to some data to respect considerations of privacy, propriety, cultural considerations, and security that often preclude complete openness and the complete attainment of that ideal. That is to say, for the most part, data, and even scientific data, fall on a continuum from completely closed to completely open. And there's no discrete category, just open or closed data, at least not yet. Next slide, please. Of course, even when that ideal state of open data can be achieved by the community, open data are relatively ineffective as a tool for investigation when they cannot be easily found or accessed by would-be users. And for this reason, the open science community, and I know many of us in the room and certainly on the panel are part of that community, we've more or less coalesced around what we call the FAIR principles for scientific data. That's most famously articulated by Wilkinson and colleagues in the 2016 Nature article that open data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now, I think that the other panelists may have more to say about the findable and accessible components of data fairness and the relative success that we in the community have had in making data findable and accessible, particularly digital data on the internet. So I want to focus a bit more acutely on the arguably harder components of interoperability and reusability of open data. These are where some of the real challenges are for us and where the real policy comes into play. There are at least three high-level reasons for why we want to value interoperability and reusability of data. They can be broadly characterized as trustworthiness, acceleration, and equity. First, we say that science needs to be replicable to be trustworthy. Some disciplines have seen recently recent attention drawn to the challenges of replicability in their fields, and reusability of data is a primary mechanism that supports replication of results. And so we should be developing policies that help really elevate the circumstance for reusability of data. Second, interoperability accelerates discovery and translation for both academic and business users of data. Barriers to both intra and interdisciplinarity are reduced when the data systems can communicate with one another through strong interoperability principles. Putting these together, interoperability and reusability allow for data to be combined in new ways to inform and update old results and findings, and they also drive the leading edge of discovery. Further, interoperability and reusability support equity in science, particularly salient for federally funded data. Ensuring that data can be reused reduces unnecessary duplication, which is not the same thing, of course, as replication, which is necessary in science. It provides the ability for new sets of eyes to examine data that might not have otherwise done so. And interoperation helps to more evenly distribute data assets across a very unevenly funded interdisciplinary landscape in the federal portfolio. So my focus here on reusability and interoperability is really here to emphasize that they enhance the findability and the accessibility components of the FAIR principles, and they make science more inclusive and equitable overall. Next slide, please. Now, we are in the federal government or I'm in the federal government. We're sort of interested in what are the policy and practice opportunities on the horizon. And we think that there are real opportunities here to innovate towards transforming open data with accelerating the FAIR principles. Here, I'm going to point toward three such opportunities involving research silos, infrastructural needs, and guidance standards that we feel that the administration and federal agencies can help with. First, we recognize that research silos contribute to barriers to data sharing broadly. How does this happen? Well, this is by lowering the appetite for interoperability and reusability of data on a fundamental level. So many take the approach that research silos need to be broken down and torn apart, but those same research silos exist because of their successes in incremental science. And so rather than break them down, there's a real opportunity for policymakers and funders to incentivize opening up those silos and building bridges across established labs. Part of that incentive is lowering the barriers to collaboration by making data more interoperable for use across the disciplines. Naturally, the efforts require infrastructure. The federal government, of course, is heavily involved in investments in research and development infrastructure, but these should be considered both technical and human resources or human resource infrastructure. Excellent infrastructure exists already, including through storage capacity, data translators, APIs, and common data models that are all available on the market today, and they should be considered for how they can be adapted for use to make data more interoperable, more reusable, just as they are currently being adapted to make data more findable and accessible. And on the policy and practice side, we recognize that closed source proprietary data collection, curation, and storage systems might impede the interoperability, and we should reconsider how they may be a barrier to achieving fair data and open data principles, and at least are a barrier to those ideals. Moreover, our investments in interoperability and reusability infrastructure should consider the whole life course of the scientific enterprise, from training emerging users, which is so important that we have training established for the next generation of scholars, but so is training of established users and existing labs. Labs that have traditionally used the silo model can be resourced to develop interoperability and reusability plans that their incoming cohorts of fellows and early career individuals can deploy. And support for retooling established labs is important to consider and may provide for innovation and shaping the incentives for investigators and institutions to make data more open. Of course, solid infrastructure is only as good as the standards supporting the actual implementation of that infrastructure. Uniform data models, open standards, and guidance should be amendable and revisable as new technology and new research paradigms come online. That's why we're all effectively here with these FAIR principles today. If we want to realize a future where open data is entirely fair, then those standards will necessarily need to be dynamic. Recently, the National Science Technology Council's Subcommittee on Open Science released guidance on desirable characteristics of data repositories for federally funded data. The guidance concludes with a very strong statement that's intended to be a living document and ultimately revisable with that future in mind. There's also a major opportunity for thought leadership and innovation in how one aspect of open data fairness may spill over into another aspect. For example, making data more interoperable may improve its accessibility and reusability simply by the virtue that it can be, by definition, linked to other open data sets. Many federal agencies that conduct or fund science are already engaged in policy and practice efforts to transform towards open and fair data. Next slide, please. Here, I'm going to highlight just a few of the many examples across the government. First, in January of next year, the National Institutes of Health's Data Management and Sharing Plan, final policy, will go into effect and will require for the first time that investigators and have plans to share their NIH-funded data with the public, and that the Data Management and Sharing Plan expects, barring individual privacy and other limitations, that the data is to be shared as openly as possible. Second, National Science Foundation recently launched and will soon announce the awardees of their PHAROS program that will fund research coordination networks aimed at catalyzing the scientific community around innovative strategies to make research products, including open data, more fair. And the Department of Energy, in their Office of Science and also the Office of Science Technical Information, they're engaged in transformative practices by providing the public their pure data resources that include data repositories, knowledge bases, analytic platforms, and a whole other host of activities that make curated data publicly available to help further scientific discovery and help advance technical knowledge. And importantly, they also provide digital object identifiers to research outputs for their grantees and for their interagency collaborators for data and code. They welcome further interagency coordination for other funders to do the same. So this includes DOIs, for example, for data. Finally, there's NASA's TOPS program, which I know you'll hear more about on the panel later today. This literally aims to move NASA's Science Mission Directorate to transform to open science with the goals of increasing understanding, accelerating discovery, and broadening participation in science through, I think, a really, truly transformative program. It features not just open data, but open curriculum, open source software, and open knowledge. The leadership in this space at NASA has been recognized by OSTP. Recently, NASA's new leadership position is an ode to this on the National Science Technology Council Subcommittee on Open Science, which deliberates much of the efforts that I've discussed in these examples today. Next slide, please. That's all I have for you. I want to thank everybody for their time. Again, I want to be very gracious and thank the Wilson Center for the invitation. I know we're all very much looking forward to the panel discussion next, and I welcome your comments and questions. We are looking forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Chris, for that really thoughtful opening. I think that sets the stage very nicely for the next part of our agenda today, which is a panel discussion, which, among other things, will address the sort of collaborations, infrastructure, as we've already heard about, and policies needed to facilitate adoption, and also to think about mitigating current barriers. So I'm very pleased to also welcome Stefan Verholst as our moderator today. Stefan is a co-founder, chief of R&D, and director of the data program at the Governance Laboratory, GovLab, where he's building an action-oriented foundation on how to transform governance using advances in science, data, and technology. His latest scholarship really centers on how responsible data and technology can improve people's lives, and the creation of more effective and collaborative forms of governance. So in particular, and we'll hear more about this as we go, I'm sure, he's really interested in the perils and promises of collaborative technologies, and also how to harness the unprecedented volume of data and information that we have to advance the public good. So thank you so much, Stefan. Looking forward to your panel discussion now.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison, for having me, and delighted to be on this panel. And thanks, Chris, for setting the stage. I think it provides a really good foundation for a discussion about what is the title of today's session: what's next in policy and practice as it relates to open data. And as already was mentioned, I'm the co-founder of GovLab, but I'm also the lead of its Open Data Policy Lab, which we created a few years ago. And so part of the function of the Open Data Policy Lab is to really look into how do we accelerate, how do we go beyond what we currently have as it relates to open data, including, of course, open science, but also open government data, but also access to privately held data for public interest purposes. And so last year, and we did actually a whole assessment of what is the current state, not to a level that we will hear from Silvana, but at least from an understanding on what is the current state and where do we need to make progress, what is the next wave of open data. And so we released a report which was called the third wave of open data, and I'm not gonna go into full detail what the report said, but I think it suffices to, as an opening of this panel, to perhaps raise a few elements that I feel we can discuss and where we actually do need to make progress as it relates to open data, and that we need to embed in the next generation of policy and practices, which is what we will discuss. The first one was, or the first remark I want to make to set the stage, is that we do need to bridge the different communities that care about open data, right? And I think we have, of course, the open science community, but we also have the open government community, and we have also communities caring about citizen science that also, of course, wants to also open up and donate even individual data sets as well. And too often, I feel myself on panels with either the one community or the other community, and I think we do need to bridge those communities towards a common goal of actually providing access to data so that we can reuse it in other ways to improve society, to improve science, but also to improve decision-making in the public interest. And so I'm delighted that today's panel actually does represent those different communities, and we will perhaps touch upon that as well. Second remark I want to make is that we, after now more than a decade of at least investment in both open science and open data, and of course, in some cases longer, we also have come to the realization that by just making data open, it's not always as impactful. We actually need to be more intentional in the purpose for which we actually provide data. That does not mean that, of course, it should be the default, but it also means that we actually do need to have a clearer sense about possible use cases for which we actually do make data open. And we will touch upon that perhaps during this panel as well. The third remark I want to make at the outset is that it's not just about releasing data, it's actually also about new forms of collaboration. Collaboration between those that have the data and those that need the data, and really finding ways to actually be more collaborative and participatory, as already was mentioned, in actually the reuse of data for other purposes. And so open data is also a new way of actually collaborating. It's not just about releasing data as well, or it should be a new way of collaborating, because we quite often see that people declare victory if their data is just made open. And I think it's a first step, but it should also be more proactive with the ones that can use it as well. And then lastly, we've heard from Chris a lot of policy work, and that's wonderful, of course, but a lot of the policy is, of course, more normative. Yeah, you should or you shall. And I think we need to go beyond that, and we also need to think about what are then the incentives in addition to the normative reasons for doing so, right, that will actually unlock open data. And I think we've had some policies in place, and we can always use more, but we also have learned that we actually need to think about the incentive structure for actually being part of an open data, open science ecosystem. And that's something that we will touch upon as well. And these are elements that I wanted to share at the outset of this panel to determine what's next in policy, because these are reflections, they are not solutions. And again, the question is, how do we go about those reflections? How do we make those actually more stick? How do we implement them as well? Now, these are the parameters perhaps for a discussion. And I'm delighted that we have a tremendous panel to take these on and to reflect on some of those elements. And I'm delighted to introduce the panel, which then subsequently will provide some opening reflections. And then we can go into Q&A, and I will hopefully bring Chris back to also the panel, because I do also have some suggestions and some questions actually with regard to what Chris had said, and he might actually have some reactions to what he's heard on the panel as well. But without further ado, let me introduce first Silvana Fumega, who is the project director of the Global Data Barometer. And as already mentioned, it's a massive undertaking to actually understand what is the current state of data and data reuse, right? And I think they just released a Global Data Barometer, which is and will be the baseline to actually have a conversation about the current state of open data, especially as it relates to particular kind of data sets. In her free time, no, I'm joking, in addition to being the project director, she is also the research and policy director of ILDA, because I can only assume how much time the Global Data Barometer must take to actually conduct. So I can imagine that ILDA probably is worried about anyway, your time commitments towards ILDA, which is, by the way, the open data initiative with regard to Latin America, and has done tremendous work in the region towards advancing open data as well. Now, in addition to Silvana, we have Elena Stepanaitis, who is the program executive in NASA's Chief Science Data Office. And we already heard from Chris a lot of expectation on what's happening in NASA. So no pressure, Elena, on fulfilling Chris's drum roll here on what's happening in NASA, where you actually also work on open source science, the initiative as such. And then last but not least, we have Ramanathan Gutta, who is the founder of datacommons.org, which is an initiative that seeks to aggregate data from a variety of data sources into a unified database so it can be used by students and researchers in a more active and a more user-friendly way. And of course, we already got introduced in the importance of not just accessing data, but also making it reusable. And I think Data Commons is a great initiative towards that end. But of course, Gutta has done a lot more. He is behind RSS, RDF, and schema.org, all standards that are actually driving this whole open data, open science community, and is also a Google Fellow and a Vice President at Google as well. So with that, you can already imagine what a wonderful panel we will have and what a conversation we will have following each introduction. And over to you, Silvana, to kick us off. And then we go to Elena and Gutta as well. Over to you.
First of all, thank you, Stefan. Yes, I don't have a lot of free time, at least those days, but in my free times, I deliver presentations to these great people. No, I'm just kidding. First of all, yes, I want to be really grateful for this opportunity, in particular because, as Stefan mentioned, we usually talked to people that are related to the same field. And in this case, even though we share a lot of concepts and a lot of things that we want to achieve, we don't usually talk to each other. And I mean by that, people working on open government data, and in some cases, open science, or even it could be privacy and many other communities that are all related to each other. But in general, sadly, we don't talk as often as we should. In the particular case of this presentation, I want to tell you a little bit. I'm going to try to be pretty brief about the Global Data Barometer and the first edition, as Stefan was mentioning before. And basically, what I want to say before all of that is that around, I don't know, like 10 years ago, a little bit more than that, we started, me and many other people in the field, to be part of a group of people talking about openness and government data. Again, I want to be clear where I'm coming from. It's the space of open government data. And initially we were hearing that everything should be open and people will come and they will use it. And in that way, value, could be social or individual, will be generated. More than 10 years later, we know that the agenda is way more complex than open and they will come. And nowadays, for example, we are talking and thinking about issues such as privacy and care of data, protection of human rights in the development of technological interventions, development of techniques and tools for machine learning, digital security, data governance structures, inclusion in the production of data and algorithms, and all these topics can no longer be ignored in this agenda. These issues complicate the initial open government data agenda, whose principal and almost exclusive concern was to increase the accessibility of public data. So now we know that we should ask ourselves much more complex questions, and we are getting increasingly aware of the complexity of data ecosystem and also about all the groups and problems we were leaving outside of this agenda, and we can't do that anymore. So in that sense, our work is increasingly interconnected with many areas and many groups that probably we were not thinking or interacting with a decade ago. But this complexity is also making our work much more meaningful. Also, this complexity, I'm sorry that I'm repeating this word so many times, asks for new ways of assessing our work and the status of the agenda. And that's where the Global Data Barometer comes from. And that's what I'm gonna show you a little bit today. And I'm gonna try to be pretty brief. As I was mentioning, this year, or Stefan was mentioning as well, this year in May, we launched the first edition, or the first results of the first edition of the Global Data Barometer, almost a decade after the launch of the Open Data Barometer. That was another initiative trying to measure the status of open data around the world. And why we did that? Why there's a new way of measuring things? Because this complexity that I was mentioning about in data ecosystem asks for new benchmarks and new ways of understanding and collectively learning about it. The goal of this barometer is to provide this new benchmark and the key data needed to better understand the state of data for public good around the world. Basically, what it does, it draws on primary data coming from a global expert survey carried out in mid-2021 in 109 countries, and it was combined with secondary data from trusted sources to generate a range of metrics. The period that we were measuring is May 2019 to May 2021. What we wanted to do, sorry, I'm trying to look at both screens, is to provide critical knowledge in terms to fill critical knowledge gaps on how data policy and practices are unfolding in different sectors, regions, and countries. What we did is to look at the landscape beyond just open data and through a series of thematic lenses. They are, for example, land, political integrity, climate action, health, public contracting, company information, and public finance. Here, I'm gonna show you some numbers about this first edition. As I was mentioning, we have 109 countries, 12 regional hubs that were helping us to gather all this information, 7 thematic partners, 39 indicators, more than 60,000 data points. And inside the report and the website, you'll find also around more than 1,100 data sets, more than 100 frameworks, and more than 70 open data initiatives. All of this been done following the idea that answers, methodology, weighting criteria should be published and out there for everybody to check and provide inputs. And because we believe that standard measurements and other tools should be open, transparent, and inclusive, and that's what we were trying to do throughout the past couple of years. And in terms of the structure, what we are doing is looking at that data issues through 4 pillars that are governance, capability, availability, and use and impact. And the indicators, the 39 that I mentioned before, fit these 4 pillars with 2 core modules, assessing data governance and capabilities throughout the country, and the 7 thematic modules that I mentioned before. 5 of them revolve around money, accountability, and power, and they were developed in partnership with expert organizations. For example, you can see there OGP, Transparency International, Open Contracting, Open Ownership, GIFTS, Land Portal. And also we were covering 2 pressing issues that are climate actions and health and COVID. Just to give you an idea of how the structure looks like. And there you can see how the core modules, the thematic modules, and the pillars are structured. So I'm not gonna go into much detail about the process, but basically it lasted during a period of around 6 months last year. And there was also a review that was conducted on the data with the support of our thematic partners. I'm gonna show you just a little bit of the result. Oh, sorry, these are the regional partners that I mentioned about. Just very briefly, these are some of the average results by module globally, but I'm not gonna go into much detail because I think the discussion that we're gonna have later is gonna be much more interesting, and there you can go into globaldatabarometer.org and check all the results. But basically, before finishing, I want to provide some brief observations. I provided this overview just to let you know where I'm coming from and where these findings are coming from. So one of the things that we learn with this data is that developing and using data for the public good is possible. Virtually all the norms established by the Barometer are in theory attainable today. However, the scores, as I was showing you before, show us that there is still a long way to go. When thinking about open government data, even though we are talking about data in general, open government data is still a key component in this measurement. What we can see is that these agendas are alive, but they are no longer progressing in a linear way. What I'm trying to say is that they are not increasing at the same rate that they were increasing in a few years ago. Also, another point, and very briefly, is that capacity gaps remain a significant barrier to delivering value from data. In that sense, I'm meaning skills, training, infrastructure. While the digital divide may be narrowing in some places, gaps still exist across government, private sector, civil society, in their ability to create and use data for the public good. Another thing, and it was mentioned before as well, is that well-drafted frameworks potentially deliver better data. When rules are explicit about data collection, management, and sharing, data is much more likely to be available, useful, and sustainable in addressing any number of issues for the public good. And also, I mean, it was mentioned the collaboration. What we saw is that collaboration between, for example, traditional civil society and civic technologies, or between journalists and private sector application providers are driving new uses of data that could highlight corruption, promote public integrity, or shape public policy debate. You can see, I mean, I'm gonna show you a little bit some of the examples that we have in our report, but you can go there and check many more of them. And another thing that I'd like to stress is that there is a clear evidence that partnerships and the work of international organizations in terms of advocacy of certain topics are showing results in terms of advancing the agenda. Just a few more things before wrapping up, because I know that we don't have a lot of time, is that I want to make a few points in terms of moving forward, because some of the ideas of the discussion today was to think about the future of this agenda, and also the connection and the overlapping between the different agendas. In some cases, just only 3 points that I'd like to highlight is that something that we need to work on is to increase the transparency of government data use by making the public more aware of when governments are collecting, sharing, and using data. This can promote more accountable data practices and support greater collaboration across sectors in using data effectively. Also, as I was mentioning before, we need to support cross-sector partnership for data use. Also, in that sense, develop robust data sharing frameworks, including the subnational level, so that the potential data abuses are limited and the positive reuse of data is enabled. And also, I think we need to deepen the emphasis on equity and inclusion, recognizing that data governance, capability, availability, and use only need to explicitly consider the needs of marginalized population. That's something that probably we were not thinking in the same way a decade ago. And one last point that I'd like to make in terms of use and value is that measuring use of data in an international independent comparative exercise like the one that we were trying to do last year is not an easy task. We have explored an approach centered on representative use cases in order to gain a rough comparative understanding of data use and impact, but we need to keep discussing and exploring this point, because there's still a lot of room for improvement in order to understand the value of data, in order to keep working on this agenda. I'm going to stop here because I think I take quite some time, but I want to once again invite everybody to explore the website, the report, the results, and I'm looking forward to this conversation, because once again, I think there are many concepts and overlappings between the different agendas. So I'm looking forward to more conversations like this one in the future as well.
Great, thanks so much, Silvana, and thanks for this wonderful overview. And several years ago, I wrote a piece, which you may remember, where I advocated that we need more data about data. And I think the Global Data Barometer actually does provide us kind of new data sets about actually the use and the release of data that we need to inform policy, but also to actually be able to take stock and have the conversation that we have today with regard to what's next. But over to Elena.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Can you see my slides? Great, okay. Well, thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you to the Wilson Center for the invitation to speak today. I'm really excited to tell you all about what we're doing to support open science at NASA. So I'm Dr. Elena Stepanidis. I'm a program executive in NASA's Chief Science Data Office, and there I support NASA's open source science initiative. Today I'm going to talk a bit about open science at NASA and give a broad overview of what we're doing in terms of policy and outreach. So with that, I'd like to start with the working definition of open science that we use at NASA when we think about how we'll support it. We define open science as a collaborative culture enabled by technology that empowers the open sharing of data, information, and knowledge within the scientific community and the wider public to accelerate scientific research and understanding. So there are a few different parts to this definition, but two that I'd like to point out that I'll touch on again are the words collaborative and community. And as Christopher alluded to in his talk, it's not just about, open science is not just about making things available and pointing to them and saying, hey, look, this is available, you can use it. But it's really about making scientific information and resources accessible to the community via tools, outreach, et cetera. So this is a very engaged initiative that we're undergoing. And it's something that really thrives on community participation. So that's very important to us at NASA, is participation in the community. I just want to introduce you to a phrase that you may hear a lot when hearing about NASA's open science activities. And that is open source science. And open source science is just NASA's method for putting open science into practice. So this involves really opening the scientific process from beginning to end with support from policy and infrastructure, community involvement in the scientific process and in development of best practices, openness and accessibility of data, software, and publications, so scientific information, and I'll talk more about that later. All the scientific information that we use, access, and produce as scientists and members of the public, the openness of that information is really critical. So that's critical to open source science, which is NASA's methodology. So, let's see there, okay. A little bit about the principles behind open source science. What makes open science open? And all of these things that I'm about to talk about, all these principles, they all kind of overlap with one another somewhat, but they're all important components of what we're trying to support the community in achieving. First of all, open science is transparent. So process and results should be visible, accessible, and understandable to users and interested parties. Open science is accessible. So Christopher mentioned the fair data principles, and that's something that we are also interested in. So data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Open science is inclusive. The scientific process and participants in the scientific process should welcome participation by and collaboration with diverse people and organizations. And I would also add encourage participation. So really try and facilitate participation. And finally, open science is reproducible. So members of the community should be able to reproduce scientific results based on open documentation. So all of these principles together form the basis of what we're talking about when we're talking about open science, open source science. And the unifying idea here, and I'm going to come back to this, is that open science isn't just about passively making things open. It's really about actively encouraging and facilitating a culture of inclusion and accessibility, and making sure that community members have the tools and best practices they need to participate in a transparent process that emphasizes access for all. So that's really important to what we're doing at NASA, the idea that we're trying to make the process more transparent and accessible. So that's kind of the philosophical ideas behind what we're doing. But in terms of policy, there's sort of a framework that this is all based on. And the foundation of that framework at NASA is a strategy that was released in 2018, which is available on NASA's website, and that is the SMD, or Science Mission Directorate, strategy for data and computing for groundbreaking science. So like I said, you can find it online, and the strategy has 3 goals. The first is to develop capabilities to actually do open science, so develop and implement these capabilities. The second is to undergo continuous evolution of data and computing systems to support open science. And the third goal is to harness the community and strategic partnerships for innovation. So there's that community again, community partnerships. Open science is all about community and engagement. Next slide, okay. So what is NASA's open source science initiative? So this is something that you may also hear about with respect to NASA and open science. NASA's open source science initiative is there to basically implement this strategy, to implement the NASA's data and computing strategy for groundbreaking science. And it's a program of activities that support moving science towards openness. So this can include policy adjustments, support for open source software, support and enabling of open science infrastructure. So the Open Source Science Initiative is very active in supporting all of these different things. It's a big part of what we're doing. So another thing that I would like to mention is this document, Scientific Information Policy, or SMD policy document, SPD 41. So SPD 41 brings together existing NASA and federal guidance on openness for data, software, and publications for federally funded work. And SPD 41, which is also available online for those interested, it applies to all new SPD funded, SMD, Science Mission Directorate, funded activities related to the production of scientific information that started September 2021 and later. And the motivating idea behind SPD 41 is that scientific information be as open as possible, but as close as necessary, kind of going back to what Chris talked about. Some things need to be closed, but we would like to be as open as possible. So that is what SPD 41 is about. And SPD 41 policy really offers guidelines for openness in the scientific process. So this is a very broad overview of what's in SPD 41. So I'm not going to read through each one individually, but SPD 41 includes language about openness of data, openness of software, and publications related to NASA, to SMD funded work. So it describes how scientific data and on what timescales scientific data, scientific software, and publications should be made available to the public. And finally, in my last couple of minutes, last but not least, I'd like to talk about Transform to Open Science, which is the initiative that Christopher mentioned also in his talk. And Transform to Open Science is really the outreach component of this work, and it's meant to support adoption of open science practices in the community. So the objectives of TOPS are to increase adoption and understanding of open science, and in doing so, accelerate major scientific discoveries, to broaden participation in the scientific process by historically underrepresented communities. So really to lay the groundwork for people to come and participate in the scientific process and make that participation as equitable as possible. And so with that, I will, this is a very exciting initiative. 2023 will be the year of open science for TOPS. And just a final point that I'd like to highlight, as we approach the year of open science, NASA TOPS will be rolling out a 5-module curriculum. And this curriculum is designed around the scientific workflow, and it will be open and free for all to take. And upon completion of the modules, the user will receive a NASA Open Science badge and certification, which will represent their newfound understanding of open science in practice. And with that, thank you very much to the Wilson Center for having me, and I will conclude.
Thanks so much, Elena, for this excellent overview of both open science and then specifically what NASA is contributing towards the broader movement of open science. And I also like what also Chris and then Silvana and now you, Elena, emphasized, which is not just about open, but it's also about equitable. And I think I might want to come back to that as really an issue that wasn't really at the forefront when we started with open earlier on, but that actually has become kind of an additional kind of principle, which I think is really good progress. But again, the question is, which you seems to also address, how do we then go about it? But without further ado, Gua, over to you.
Hi, thank you all for having me here. Today, I'm going to talk to you about something that we're building at Google called Data Commons. To set the context, there's a ton of data out there, and we do have an enormous amount of open data out there. This data is essential for everything from science and journalism and to policy and to consumers. Unfortunately, using this data is extremely painful. Involves foraging for the data, tracking down the assumptions, data wrangling that is repeated over and over again. A great analogy is with satellite imagery. NASA had done the hard work and put its Landsat imagery up on its website in the late 90s. Unfortunately, it was so difficult to use, very, very few people did. What Google Earth and then Maps did was it basically did all this data wrangling once and for all and made it available to use for everybody in a very easy fashion and literally changed the way we look at the world around us. We have a similar situation today with data. Imagine you want to ask a question like which California counties are most at food risk from climate change. The data to answer this actually exists out there, but it involves so much work that often the first step in answering this question is to write a grant proposal. Imagine just being able to ask in natural language and start exploring the space. This is exactly what the Data Commons project has been working on at Google for almost the last 4 years. What we've done is we've taken a very large number of different data sets, and the idea is to do the data wrangling once and for all. We clean the data, we build schemas on top of schema.org, we align references to places and attributes and all of that stuff and create a giant aggregated knowledge graph. This thing is too big for most people to download. You can download it if you want, and so we provide APIs on top of which applications can be built. It's important to note the distinction between data commons versus collections of data sets. There have been many data set portals, starting with data.gov, Dataverse, and so on. Many different formats ranging from CSVs to PDFs to whatever else, and it kind of partially solves the problem of finding the data. More recently, you've had data hubs, collections of relational databases, Google's Analytics Hub, and many other such offerings. They solve some of the problem of cleaning the data, but some of the hardest problems remain, which is aligning the schemas so that you can join data from different sources. One of my favorite examples is Census versus FBI versus Eurostat versus the Drug Enforcement Agency all use different ways of referring to the same places. The Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis definition of employment is different. And so today it is up to the user of the data to resolve all these differences. The Data Commons approach is to try and resolve these differences to the extent possible and to create one sort of super data set. So concretely, what have we built? There's open source cloud-based infrastructure for creating, storing, and serving these knowledge graphs. There's a suite of visualization tools. There's also a machine learning and data science curriculum based on all this material. And on the proprietary side, there's integration with Google search engine so that you can actually ask questions in natural language. Most of the work has actually been on the data. People and places, demographics, economics, health, food, crime, education. There's a huge focus on climate change and sustainability that I'll mention and talk about in a few minutes. Climate, energy, water, agriculture, emissions. And there's also other things. There's a biomedical data commons that is being built, which is all the UniProt, Genva, ENCODE, CDC Wonder, and all of this work. To give you an idea of the scale of this beast, it's about close to 3 billion time series now. It's about 4 times the size of FRED, which is the Federal Reserve's econometric database. So it's already substantially big, and it's becoming much bigger. There's different target audiences. There's consumers who can access this data through natural language search. There's policy folks and journalists, what I call non-programming researchers, who can use dashboards, visualization tools, and data commons and elsewhere. There's application builders who can access this data through REST APIs, and a special class of them are the people building AI models. The 3 pillars of AI are algorithms, compute, and data commons comes in to help with the data. Let me start with some examples of use for, these are queries that you can do in Google search today. So let me actually be brave, and you could do something like energy use per capita in India. This top result that you get over here comes from data commons, or something local, number of unemployed in California. This result here comes from data commons, or something much more complicated like number of poor Hispanic women in Santa Clara County. And Google search now has the ability to understand, parse these queries, and pull out the answers from data commons. And if you want more, you can go exploring. This is a dashboard, for example, about Santa Clara County, and we have similar things about every place in the US and most places across the world. And places meaning not just counties, but counties, cities, zip codes, and so on. Here you have everything from the income to employment data, to poverty levels, to health conditions, to equity, to education and environment and demographics. And you can do a deeper dive into something like the environment and get data about the air quality, about lifetime cancer risk, or pivot around and say, show me the difference, the place counties according to lifetime cancer risk. And you get the basic idea. All of this stuff and more trivially easily available from across many different federal agencies, international organizations, and so on. One of the driving applications recently has been sustainability. And there's just 2 aspects of climate change and sustainability. One is the science and engineering of net zero, better batteries, better grid, and so on. And the other one is adaptation and resilience. Some level of climate change is happening. Climate deltas vary widely across places. Existing food, health, shelter, and securities are going to be worsened, and we have to prepare. So let me dive a little bit deeper into that. Climate change data is open data. NASA, you can pick up the 70,000 plus net CDF files from NASA. They have, and if you have adequate compute power, you can go parse them, map them onto maps, and so on. Good news is you don't have to do that because we've done that for you. Climate change, if you look at popular media, they'll make it out to be 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees versus 2.5 degrees. It's a lot more complicated than that. Climate deltas vary widely across places. Here in this visualization that you can access on data commons, you see the temperature predictions for summer of 2050, according to one of NASA's more popular models, relative to 2006. We mapped it to counties, and this is according to the RCP 2.6, which corresponds to a roughly 1.5 degree temperature change. And you can see that even in this ultra optimistic model, there are places in this country where the temperature is likely to cross over 7 degrees centigrade delta. There are other places which are going to go down by 4 degrees centigrade. The average may be 1.5, but that's like saying that your head is in the oven, your foot is in the freezer, but your average is 1.5, you're okay. The other thing that happens is that there are many existing inequities. Again, all this data is from data commons: hunger, poverty, health conditions, even things like insurance. And the one thing we know is that climate change is going to worsen these. And we have to prepare. In order to prepare, we have to know who's going to be most affected 10, 20, 30 years from now. And to do that, we need data not just about the climate, but data about health, food, farming, water, employment, and so much more. These are very messy data ecosystems. Just at the US federal level, this data is in silos across all of these and many more agencies. Somebody needs to go organize this so that mere mortals can go draw conclusions from these things. And this is exactly Google's wheelhouse. Organize the data and make it easily accessible. And that's what we're doing. But because this is such a defining challenge of our generation, we've decided to do this in an open fashion. Open meaning not just is the data going to be open, not just is the entire software stack for this going to be open, but the process by which we build this is going to be open. So all of the processes that for building this take place on GitHub, which is open to everybody. And we are in active collaborations with academia, government, and even other companies in order to build this together. A huge number of topics have already been covered, including these, and many, many, many more are coming. But let me give you just a couple of examples to give you a flavor for the kind of stuff that now becomes possible. This is one more of our tools. It's a scatter tool. The x-axis is the expected temperature rise. The y-axis is the prevalence of coronary heart disease. We know that coronary heart disease becomes worse with the rising temperatures. And what's interesting here is not the correlation or lack thereof, but the counties to the top and right. And we can see there are counties in South Dakota, there are counties in New Mexico and other places which are going to be in trouble. In many ways, during the COVID times, we all looked at the Johns Hopkins dashboard to figure out what was happening where. For the next few decades, we need something like that, except 3 orders of magnitude more sophisticated, much more of a platform on which other people can build. And that is exactly what we're building over here. And it's, of course, not restricted to just temperature rise. This is the same coronary heart disease versus the percentage of people without health insurance. And it's really sad to see that the same counties in South Dakota and New Mexico and so on appear in the bad quadrant. This is a percentage of irrigated land versus projected temperature rise, which has fairly strong consequences for agriculture. The best way to look at education is a big part of what we are doing. And then this lab that is run at Berkeley in their DS100 class is a good example of this. Students are asked to build a model of obesity as a function of blood pressure, unemployment, and poverty. This would be a term project sized thing because of the amount of data wrangling involved. But if the data is the platform, it becomes much easier. And we have hundreds of students do this in under an hour for grade. The top is obesity versus blood pressure, what you would expect. The middle is versus unemployment, and the bottom is versus poverty. We do lots of collaborations, as I mentioned. This is a collaboration with a lab at Stanford, and where we build models to predict wet bulb temperature. And wet bulb temperature is the temperature at 100% relative humidity. And these are the places on the world where over the next decade or so, we expect these thresholds to be crossed. Oh, an important thing is when the wet bulb temperature grows above 35 degrees centigrade, humans can't survive because we can't get rid of the heat that our body generates. And if you have anything like cardiac conditions and so on, it's much more like 32 degrees. These are the places where we expect those thresholds to be crossed for over 5 hours in a single day. And unfortunately, some of these predictions have already come true in India. One last topic, which is the model is not one data common sort of one ring to bind them all, but it's much more similar to the web, which you have many different websites. And all these different websites use one common schema, which is HTML, and one common API, which is HTTP. Same model here. We all use the same vocabulary to talk about the data. We use the same set of APIs. But just like some websites are behind firewalls, some are behind paywalls, same model applies over here. And just like you don't have to switch browsers when you look at your intranet versus the public web. And your intranet can link to the public web. Similarly, we can have many different data commons, and the analog of linking is joining. It's like the little piece of data that you have with your internal data commons is now layered on top of all the data that is in the big public data commons. And with this, we can actually solve answer the question that I raised right at the beginning of which California counties are most at food risk. Feeding America is an NGO that helps run a lot of food pantries in this country. And they have developed something called the meal gap, which is a measure of the food insecurity across different counties. And you could go to datacommons.feedingamerica.org and answer, and look at this visualization, for example. The x-axis is the food insecurity index. The y-axis is the expected temperature rise. Each dot here is a California county, and you can see the counties that are most at risk. So and there's so much more, and we can actually go over there to get an idea of how powerful this whole thing becomes once you can combine all this data in a single place. It's not just food insecurity, but this is an analysis of cardiac illness versus food insecurity in this country, an analysis which should have taken many months or more to do, which now becomes a matter of seconds. And that is the correlation between food insecurity and cardiac illness in the US. It's kind of a sobering note, but on that note, I will end. We would like to collaborate with everybody. We are easy to reach, datacommons.org. And thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much, Kua, and very powerful here. And we have about 30 minutes remaining, or even less. And so let me kickstart a panel discussion, and I will go to each person, but the other persons could also chime in and see whether they want to contribute to the question. And of course, feel free to ask questions. And I will also use some of the questions that have been asked beforehand as well. And let me start with Silvana. And actually, one of the questions that audience members already asked beforehand was, how do you put this within a perspective of developed versus developing kind of world, right? So the global data barometer is obviously global. And so from your perspective, how does open data, and including also even the whole open science, if you're willing to reflect on that, the whole open science discussion and movement, how does that differ depending on whether you are in different parts of the world? And how do we, anyway, even use this as an opportunity to actually bring everyone at the kind of same level, given the fact that open data obviously has a huge amount of value propositions here, as we've heard as well. Silvana, any reactions from your end?
Yeah, well, first of all, starting from developed and developing countries, I'm really glad to say that this initiative is run from a developing country. I'm based in Argentina, and the whole team is based in different countries around the world, including Latin America and Africa, and also the regional hubs that are collaborating with the Barometer are coming from different places around the world. And in that sense, I mean, what we were trying to do also, I mean, apart from collecting certain data from a survey that was exactly the same for everybody, was to think about the different contexts. So in the report, we were using the capabilities in a way to cluster countries in different ways, because I think, or at least is what I think is not really fair to measure the same things in a context where the gaps are completely different. I mean, we can't really say that the infrastructure is the same in a developed country than in a developing one. So the barriers and the gaps and the infrastructure is clearly not the same. So we need to learn a little bit about the context to also understand what we are measuring, despite that the survey is exactly the same. And in that sense, another thing that we did was one of the first questions, that it was an open question, was to ask about marginalized populations. I mean, we know that differs depending on the context, so we wanted to know about how they, depending on the national researcher, define marginalized populations in the particular country. So we have a little bit more of knowledge about the context, and all those answers you can find in the data, in the open data that we have in the website regarding all the questions and answers from all the national researchers. So in that sense, we were trying to approach the survey in a way that reflects different contexts and different realities. I mean, open data, or at least the principles behind it are the same for everybody, but we clearly understand that probably the contexts are different. So what we are trying to do is not only to measure or to try to understand what is the situation in a particular country, but also trying to understand the context. And that's the reason that we work with regional partners that clearly knows a lot better about the particular region and country than we do. And they provided like a brief analysis on the situation of the region and what are the biggest problems and those kind of things. So we can learn a little bit more and not just put a number next to a country and that's it. I mean, that's what we are trying to do. So in that sense, we were working more on a rating than a ranking. So we were not trying to put countries in an order or anything like that, but trying to provide some ideas about the context of a particular country and to see the progress in the future based on that initial benchmark. So basically that's some of the ideas. Of course, there's a lot of things to do in order to reflect those disparities, but I think at least coming from a developing country and running this international exercise is something that is clearly not something that we see every day. So in that sense, I'm really happy about that. And also something that I like to touch is about the inclusion. In that sense, I mean, as I mentioned, we ask about marginalized population, and that comes also the idea of the things that I was listening to in the different presentations about how we try to understand and to measure certain things if we don't use the same concepts and the same vocabulary to define certain problems. And in that sense, I mean, I'm wearing a different hat now. And if I'm talking from ILDA, I mean, the work on the standardization of data on feminicide at the regional level, clearly it reflects some of the problems that were discussed here, even though we are talking about official data. No, we are not talking about data that is produced in a university or research center, but still, I mean, there are at least 70 ways of describing feminicide in the countries in Latin America. And also there are different ways of defining feminicide, and I'm talking only one region. So it's really difficult to measure and to understand what's the situation of a public problem if we are not using the same vocabulary, the same concept, and the same data to portray that. Because if we don't have that, we don't really know the situation of a given region, and with that is pretty difficult to understand how to try to solve those problems if we don't clearly know the solution. So I'm mixing a lot of things because some of the things were coming from the different presentations. So that's something that was coming to my mind, and this idea of trying to use at least the same vocabulary, or at least some clear definition or share definitions between different areas or topics or problems, and also trying to include as many people and as many groups as possible in our data, because if we are not including them, we hardly are thinking about the problems that are affecting them, and of course not thinking about public policies that could solve or at least ease some of the situations they are facing. So right. And I'm going to stop there.
Thanks so much. Yeah, no, thanks, Silvana, and very important insights. And I do want to go to Elena and build a little bit about, build upon what Silvana, but also Chris actually introduced, because it seems to me that FAIR is a concept that is expanding and should actually have an E in addition to the current acronym to include also equity, right? Because I think it's, as Chris said, it's not just about accessible, it's also about equitable kind of access to data. And so it seems to me that this is also part, Elena, of what you are working on, right? It's not just about making data accessible or or just collaborative. It's also focusing on making sure that communities can participate in an equitable fashion. So can you tell us a little bit about how you go about this, and what are some of the challenges and lessons learned to actually not just make it accessible, but also equitable?
Yeah, of course. So, as many of the speakers touched on before, a lot of the work that we're doing is related to lowering barriers to accessing and using data. For example, we have an activity going on right now called Unbound at NASA that, and actually, forgive me, I can't remember the acronym off the top of my head, but this activity is designed to connect communities that, and actually there was a session about Unbound at the Earth Science Information Partners conference last week. Unbound is designed to connect groups, communities, organizations that are not currently using NASA data to NASA data, and sort of offering some capacity building for how to use NASA data and how to access it. And so it's through activities like this that hopefully can help lower barriers to accessing data, and activities where we are listening to what communities need and trying to help them use the data that's available that is a big part of facilitating open science, is making sure that people can use the data.
No, this is very interesting, and I want to pick up a little bit about what the last thing you said, and then I want to go to Guha as well and bring in Chris. But the so you mentioned, because part of sometimes when I hear yeah, we're going to make data accessible for all communities, then the emphasis is quite often on access of data, but not about the questions that those communities care about. And so I've been advocating is that anyway, data, the value of data is only as good as the questions. And from an equity point of view, quite often, not everyone is part of formulating the questions. And as a result, we already have an equity issue from the first part of the scientific enterprise, right? i.e. formulating the question. And so wondering how you engage those communities in formulating the questions they care about, for which then data could be made accessible, or NASA data is being used. And that's also a kind of a question to Guha, perhaps, on and how do you, anyway, determine what questions you seek to prioritize with the data that you are making reusable, for instance, right? Do you have, anyway, are you focusing on the data sets, but are you also focusing on certain priority questions? Seems to be like sustainability has become a priority field, but are there also other ways of actually engaging communities about these are actually the top questions for which we need open, anyway, open access of data. So over to you, Elena. And then Chris might also respond to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that there are many NASA activities that focus on engaging with communities to learn that the questions they have, and because I think those questions arise from communities. We don't pass the question down to the community, and at NASA it's our job to give the scientific community and the broader community tools they can use to answer questions, and to answer the questions they're interested in answering. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I would.
So, oh yeah. So Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just to ride on the previous comments, and this goes to the broader equities issue across the globe that even Silvana was introducing, in that we need to be very mindful of not, as for the leaders in the West, not developing open science portfolio and open science research platforms that are simply just a reproduction of that old helicopter science model where we're landing in. We need to ensure that the communities engaged in providing data, engaged in using this data, are also asking the questions that are of interest to them. A colleague of mine at OSTP, Karen Andrade, has a whole portfolio in this area on community-based and community-driven research, we would say. And so we think that this is really important for the openness and the open knowledge aspect of open science. I also wanted to say that my colleague Ryan Donahue just reminded me something that you said, adding an E in terms of equitability, is that there's some in the community that want EST for equitable, secure, and transparent. So it's sort of FAIR-S data. And this was recently re-articulated by Dr. Landra Nelson at the G7 Science Ministerial, where security and transparency and scientific integrity were all components that we consider open science to be part of that same family, and that is incredibly important, that the openness and the security and the transparency, integrity are all sort of equally valued.
Interesting. So Guha, meaning obviously you can go to Google, search any question that you have, but are there ways that you also can prioritize? Because obviously, anyway, as you said, there's a lot to be done, but are there certain kinds of areas that you want to prioritize for which you made data accessible, or at least in the way that you are making it as accessible so that it can be linked? So that's my first question to you. And then the second, Guha, is anyway, when I've been in conversation about data commons for a long time, and of course the key challenge quite often is the tragedy of the commons, right? And in this case, quite often is that, how do you sustain this, right? Obviously, it seems to be that this is a great model because it's attached to Google search, I guess, which is one way to sustain it. But are there sustainability challenges, not in terms of environmental sustainability, but financial sustainability, to actually sustain that kind of commons that you are advocating for? Over to you.
So there's a bunch of different questions there. Let me first.
Yeah, two easy questions, yes, or a whole set of easy questions.
Yeah, right. Let me answer the question about fair. I think we are making a mistake in painting fair as a binary choice. It's fair or not fair. Yeah, I mean, take a look at NASA's Landsat data or today the IPCC data. It's open, have at it. Oh yeah, you need a cluster of about 10,000 machines to actually process it and do anything with it, which effectively makes it not accessible. The thing, so fair is not a binary, yes or no. It's like, how accessible is it? How interoperable is it? How and we should. It's much more nuanced than that, and it's important that we factor in these nuances in the discussion. Otherwise, it just becomes another checkbox that people will say, yep, I'm open, go find it on this server in my favorite format, and you need this tool, which is no longer supported, and so on. The second question you ask is, how are these things going to be sustainable? I've spent a lot of time, and I'm aging myself here, since the early 90s on formats and schemas and frameworks and all of that stuff. And the one thing that I've learned is that we can proselytize as much as we want about the importance of fairness, but if you want to get broad adoption, you need to tell people, you need to give people a reason to do it, which is going to matter to them at the end of the day. And for that, you need a motivating application. And that's the only way things are going to stay around, stay sustainable. In the context of our work, we talk to partners. There's 2 or 3 pillars. We talk to a bunch of companies about what are the kinds of questions that they are trying to ask. So you have a whole set of companies who are worried about the risk that their different kinds of assets, both physical assets and non-physical assets, are facing because of climate change. And to answer that is an incredibly complicated question. You need tons of data. Everything from the scope calculations to actual risks. And then for Google itself, and for our own interest, we are focused on basically, food, health, shelter. There are large populations that are going to be at incredible risk because of climate change. How do we identify these populations? How do we help them? What do we need to do in order to prepare for it? These are specific questions that we have to answer. And that's what we're doing.
Great, thanks so much. And I have so many questions that and we only have limited time. I think we have about 5 minutes here before we go into closing remarks. So why don't I go and ask everyone here kind of a broader question with regard to prioritization of what we should actually do. So imagine that Chris magically has managed to set up a dinner with the president of the United States. And the idea is that you can ask whatever you want, they will deliver, right, with regard to open science. So again, I'm not setting up Chris because this was not discussed beforehand. But Silvana, what would be your priority that it says, look, if we would only invest in this, right, we would be able to advance the next generation of open data. What would be your kind of priority question or priority ask if you know it would be able to, they would be able to implement it. So just assume anyway that we could advance that. So Silvana, and then the same question for all for Elena and Gua, and then of course Christoph has regular conversations already. So I'm gonna ask another question for Christoph. Kristen, over to you.
Well, I don't have a magic solution to say that if we do this, then suddenly all the problems are going to be solved. No, nothing like that. But I think, some of the things that we included in the survey, and I mentioned before, and I'm talking again from the open government data perspective, basic things like procurement, company information, land, climate health, and so on. There are basic things that we should know already. And if not, there are things that we need to do urgently. But apart from that, I think there are many things to do, and depending on also in the context, I mean, just as you mentioned before, I mean, publish with a purpose. I mean, you have to know what are the main problems of your context and what's the value that you're gonna put there. And also listening to demand side. I mean, it's not about just publishing data with whatever information you have in your particular government agency, but also understanding what is the demand of that data, because if not, the value is not proven, or it's not a given. So I think both things, there are things that are pretty basics, I mean, about the things that how to run a particular, in this case, we are talking about governments, but also there are many things that are particular to some contexts. So knowing what is your demand and what are the main problems that you have to face probably is gonna help on publishing certain data that can later be used because you already reach that demand. But again, not magic solutions to that.
Great. Elena, this is your opportunity.
Yeah, so I would say that I mean, NASA recognizes that there are the three different the goals of the strategic data plan, and I'm just going to highlight the capacity building and outreach goals. So for example, the Transformative to Open Science Initiative, the curriculum that they're putting out into the community is something that is really important for supporting open science, because you can't do open science without your community.
So invest in the curriculum. So that would be your request. Okay. Again, I'm not going to push here, otherwise it might become GUA.
The federal government is still the single largest funder of research in this country. You're not going to get usable, effective open data without the right incentive structures. Between DARPA, NSF, ONR, and others, you can push for the right incentive structures, not just normative, thou shalt put the data up on some server, but some other kinds of structures having everything to do with, all over the spectrum, right? And that's sort of the big stick, I won't call it a stick, it's a lever arm that you have.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to use it, because existing research communities don't like their incentive structures changed. They don't like their cheese moved. But if you can do it just the right way, you'll find sort of magic can happen.
Great. And that was actually my question to Chris, which is what are some of the incentive structures that you feel, right, needs to be emphasized and developed or reinforced? And so, Chris, you have the last word, and then I think Alison is ready to close us off in time here as well. We have like a minute, Chris, for your response. Easy question for a minute.
Yeah, easy question that I could spend another hour on. Stefan, thanks again. I just wanted to point out that you posed this question, an interesting and tough question, and any of the panelists could have said something like infrastructure or some technological answer, but what they gave you is a sociocultural answer. And I think that those are the right answers, is that we have the technical capacities. They're being built by people like GUA. They're being invested in by institutes like your own research institute, Stefan. But really, we need cultural investment, and those incentive structures are critical. And that includes things like investments and innovation in, say, the tenure system, and for getting credit to investigators for producing open source research outputs and open science research outputs. That they're incredibly important. It is challenging because those cultural norms, that really drive compliance and adoption are very deeply rooted in society. And so I think the technological capacities are actually a lot easier to solve.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Chris, Elena, Silvana, GUA, and wonderful conversation, and learned a lot. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you. And I'll repeat that. Appreciate this wonderful conversation from all of you. I would just like to say that from our side at the Wilson Center in the Science and Technology Innovation Program, and more broadly, that we are just interested in continuing this conversation. We're hoping this is the first of many, and would like, in particular, I wanted to mention a few things that really resonated with me throughout this conversation. One is the idea of openness as a spectrum. I think that that's something we can really get into more. The importance of infrastructure that Chris mentioned, and also especially that sort of social and human infrastructure. And finally, the idea of just bridging communities. I think that's something that we've started to get into within STIP over the last year or so, but would really like to investigate that more, and would be really happy to work with all of you and all of you tuning in from your own computers. So please don't hesitate to reach out to talk more about these topics, about open science in the context of both policy and practice, in particular open data. Real quickly, I'll close by mentioning that the recording for this event is accessible on the event page. I wanted to thank all of our panelists and our speakers for their amazing insights into this discussion, and to the audience for your attention and your questions, and also to the larger Wilson Center staff, and in particular our amazing AV team for making this event happen. So thank you so much for your attention and your participation, and hope to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.